He thought humiliating her would be easy, but he had no idea he was about to dismantle his own reputation in front of an entire lecture hall. The calculus auditorium at Westbridge University gleamed under bright fluorescent lights. Rows of polished desks filled with graduate students in pressed shirts and expensive laptops. All eyes trained on Professor Daniel Harrington, a man known as much for his brilliance as for his quiet disdain toward anyone he deemed unworthy. And that morning, his gaze landed on someone he clearly did not consider part of his world. Emily Carter, standing near the back wall in a simple gray cardigan and worn sneakers, clutching a stack of cleaning supplies as if she were trying to disappear into them. She had come in early to finish her shift before the class began, but the lecture had started ahead of schedule, trapping her in a room where she didn't belong, or at least, that's what everyone assumed. Harrington paused mid-equation, chalk hovering against the board as he noticed her lingering presence, his lips curling into a faint, calculated smile, the kind that never reached his eyes, and with a slow turn, he addressed the room, his voice calm but carrying just enough edge to draw attention. "It seems we have an unexpected observer today," he said, glancing directly at Emily. And instantly, a ripple of quiet amusement spread through the students, heads turning, whispers rising. A few smirks exchanged like a shared joke. Emily froze, her fingers tightening around the handle of her cart, her instinct telling her to slip out unnoticed. But something about the silence held her in place. Harrington stepped away from the board, brushing chalk dust from his tailored blazer, his posture relaxed yet deliberate. "Tell me," he continued, voice smooth, "do you find advanced calculus interesting?" The question sounded polite on the surface, but the undertone was unmistakable, and the class felt it, the tension sharpening as if the air itself had thinned. Emily hesitated, her voice soft when she finally spoke. I think it's fascinating." And a few students let out quiet laughs, not loud enough to be called out, but enough to sting, enough to reinforce exactly where she stood in their eyes. Harrington tilted his head slightly, as if intrigued, though the faint amusement in his expression betrayed him. "Fascinating," he repeated, letting the word linger. "That's quite a statement." He turned back to the board, tapping the complex equation he had been working through, lines of symbols stretching across nearly 6 feet of chalkboard space. Dense, intricate, the kind of problem that intimidated even the top students in the room. "Perhaps you'd care to share your thoughts," he added casually. But the way he stepped aside, opening the space at the board, made his intention unmistakable. The room shifted, a low murmur building as students leaned forward, sensing what was about to unfold. One student in the front row whispered, "This is going to be brutal," while another quietly unlocked their phone, angling it just enough to capture what they expected to be a moment of second-hand embarrassment. Emily's heart pounded, each beat louder than the last, her mind racing through every possible excuse to decline, to step back, to disappear, but Harrington's gaze remained fixed on her, patient, expectant, almost inviting in a way that made refusal feel like an admission of everything they already believed about her. "Go ahead," he said, his tone light, almost encouraging. "Take your time." And for a brief moment, no one moved, no one spoke. The entire lecture hall suspended in anticipation. Emily looked at the board at the layers of symbols that seemed to pulse under the harsh lighting, and something inside her shifted, not fear, not quite, but something steadier, something older. Her grip loosened on the cart, her shoulders straightened just slightly, and without another word, she stepped forward, the soft sound of her sneakers against the polished floor echoing louder than it should have. And as she reached the front, the room fell into a silence so complete it felt deliberate, almost heavy, as if everyone sensed, even then, that whatever was about to happen next would not go the way they expected. Emily Carter stopped just inches from the chalkboard, the faint scent of dust and old wood filling the air as every pair of eyes locked onto her, waiting, judging, expecting failure before she even began. And behind her, Professor Harrington folded his arms with a quiet confidence that came from years of being unquestioned, his voice cutting through the silence with a calm that felt almost rehearsed. "Whenever you are ready," he said, as if offering her a chance, though everyone in the room knew it was anything but. Emily looked at the equation again, her eyes tracing each symbol, each variable, her breathing steadying as something familiar surfaced beneath the pressure. Not panic, not confusion, but recognition, the kind that does not come from guessing, but from understanding, deep and practiced. A student near the front leaned over to his friend and whispered, "She does not even know where to start." And a few quiet chuckles followed, quickly suppressed but impossible to miss. Emily reached for the chalk, her hand pausing for just a fraction of a second before making contact. And in that moment, the room seemed to hold its breath, the kind of silence that feels heavier than noise, as if the outcome had already been decided. Harrington tilted his head slightly, observing her with mild curiosity now, as though he was interested in how long it would take before she gave up. Emily made her first mark, a clean, deliberate stroke that cut through the center of the equation. And something about the precision of that movement caused a subtle shift in the room, barely noticeable, but enough that a few students straightened in their seats. She continued, writing line after line without hesitation, her movements controlled, efficient, almost quiet in their confidence. And within seconds, the expected awkward pauses never came. There was no fumbling, no backtracking, only a steady rhythm that began to replace the earlier tension with something else, something closer to confusion. Harrington's expression changed almost imperceptibly, the faint amusement fading as his eyes narrowed, following her work more closely now, as if trying to anticipate where she might slip, where the mistake would appear, but it did not. Emily transitioned smoothly from one step to the next, simplifying complex terms in a way that felt almost effortless, and a student in the second row slowly lowered his phone, his smirk replaced by something uncertain. "Wait," someone whispered under their breath, not loud enough to interrupt, but enough to ripple through the immediate rows. Emily paused briefly, not out of uncertainty, but as if considering something, then circled a portion of the original equation, the chalk leaving a soft scraping sound that echoed slightly in the quiet room. And without turning around, she spoke, her voice calm but clear. "This part creates a contradiction under the boundary conditions," she said, and the words hung in the air like something fragile, something that should not have been said, especially not by her. Harrington's posture stiffened just slightly, a reaction so small most would miss it, but not entirely invisible. "Continue," he replied, though his tone had shifted. The confidence now edged with something sharper. Emily did, adjusting the equation, rewriting the problematic step with a cleaner transformation, one that aligned perfectly with the conditions. And as she moved forward, the solution unfolded faster, more elegant, each line building on the last with a clarity that was impossible to ignore. The room was no longer amused, no longer dismissive. It was watching, truly watching now, the earlier whispers replaced by a silence that felt different, heavier, almost electric. Harrington took a step closer, his eyes scanning her work, searching, analyzing, and for the first time, there was no immediate flaw to point out, no easy correction to assert his authority, only a growing realization that the demonstration he had orchestrated was no longer under his control. Emily reached the final line, the solution forming with a simplicity that made the entire process look almost obvious, and she placed the chalk down gently, stepping back just enough to give the board space. Her hands relaxed at her sides, her expression unchanged, not triumphant, not nervous, just steady. For a moment, no one spoke, not a single sound breaking the stillness. And then someone in the back exhaled softly, as if they had been holding their breath the entire time. Harrington stared at the board, his mind racing through each step, checking, rechecking. But the logic held, the structure was sound, and more than that, it was refined in a way he had not presented. And as he opened his mouth to respond, to reclaim the moment, to say something that would restore order, the words did not come as easily as they always had before Professor Harrington finally spoke. But the authority in his voice had thinned, replaced by something more measured, more cautious. "An interesting approach," he said, stepping closer to the board as if proximity might restore control, his eyes scanning every line Emily had written, searching for a flaw, a gap, anything he could use to reassert his position. But the longer he looked, the more his silence stretched, and the room felt it, that subtle but undeniable shift, the moment when confidence begins to fracture. Emily remained still, her gaze on the board rather than on him, as if the work itself mattered more than the reaction it had provoked, and that quiet composure unsettled him more than any argument could have. A student in the front row leaned forward, whispering, "That is not just correct, that is cleaner than what he showed." And this time, no one laughed, no one dismissed it, because they could see it too, the elegance, the efficiency, the way each step connected without excess. Harrington reached for the chalk, tapping lightly against a section of her solution. "You adjusted the transformation here," he said, his tone probing, searching for weakness. "Explain why." And for a brief moment, it sounded like a challenge again, like the familiar pattern reasserting itself, but the room knew something was different now. Emily turned slightly, not fully facing him, her voice calm and steady. "Because the original assumption creates an inconsistency when applied to the boundary conditions," she replied, echoing her earlier observation. But this time, there was no hesitation, no softness that invited dismissal, only clarity. Harrington frowned, his mind working through the logic as she spoke, and for the first time, he did not interrupt, did not correct, he listened. "If you carry it forward without adjusting," Emily continued, gesturing lightly toward the board, "the result diverges under constraint, so the solution appears valid, but it does not hold." Her explanation was simple, direct, stripped of unnecessary complexity, and that simplicity made it harder to challenge, not easier. A hush fell deeper over the room, the kind that follows realization, and somewhere in the back, someone muttered, "He missed that," barely above a whisper, but enough to ripple forward. Harrington straightened, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. "And your version resolves that?" he asked, though the question already sounded weaker than intended. Emily nodded slightly. "It aligns the transformation with the conditions, so the result remains stable," she said. And then, after the briefest pause, she added, "It is a standard correction." The words were not delivered with arrogance, not even with emphasis, but they landed with weight all the same. A few students exchanged glances, their earlier confidence gone, replaced by something closer to awe, or perhaps disbelief, because what they were witnessing did not fit the narrative they had already accepted. Harrington turned back to the board, reading through the entire solution again, slower this time, more carefully, and the longer he stood there, the more the silence pressed in, until it was no longer just quiet, but expectant, waiting for him to respond, to reclaim authority, to say something that would restore the balance that had defined every class before this one. But the balance had shifted, and everyone could feel it. He lowered the chalk slightly, his shoulders no longer as relaxed as before, and when he finally spoke, his voice lacked the effortless certainty that had once defined it. "This is not part of the standard curriculum," he said, as if that alone might reframe the moment, might place boundaries around what had just happened. Emily looked at him then, meeting his gaze for the first time, her expression unchanged, her voice just as steady. "No," she said, "but it is still correct." And that was when something in the room broke, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, like a realization, settling into place, undeniable and complete. A student in the second row slowly set his pen down. Another leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the board, and even those who had not fully understood every step could feel the outcome, the shift from assumption to recognition. Harrington opened his mouth again, perhaps to argue, perhaps to redirect, but the words hesitated, caught between what he wanted to assert and what he could no longer deny. And in that hesitation, in that brief but visible pause, the room saw it clearly for the first time. The moment when authority meets something it cannot easily dismiss, and does not yet know how to accept. The silence did not break all at once. It shifted, slowly, like a room adjusting to a truth it had not prepared for. And Professor Harrington felt it before he fully understood it, the weight of dozens of eyes no longer looking at him with automatic respect, but with something else, something questioning, something unsettled, and he straightened slightly, drawing in a measured breath as if recalibrating, as if reminding himself of who he was in this room. "Correctness," he said carefully, placing the chalk back onto the tray with controlled precision, "is only one dimension of mathematics." His voice steadier now, though not as effortless as before. Context, rigor, and established frameworks mattered just as much. It was not a dismissal, not entirely, but it was an attempt to regain ground, to shift the conversation back into territory he could define. Emily listened without interrupting, her posture calm, her hands resting loosely at her sides, and that stillness, that refusal to engage emotionally, only deepened the contrast between them. A student near the center of the room raised his hand slightly, hesitating before speaking. "But her solution follows the constraints," he said, his tone cautious, as if unsure whether he was allowed to question the structure that had always gone unchallenged. In that moment the words left his mouth, a ripple moved through the room, subtle but undeniable, because it was no longer just Emily standing at the front. It was the beginning of others seeing what she had revealed. Harrington's gaze shifted toward the student, sharp for a brief second, then controlled again. "It is unconventional," he replied, emphasizing the word as though it carried more weight than it actually did. "And unconventional methods require scrutiny." But even as he spoke, his eyes flicked back to the board, drawn again to the clarity of the solution, to the absence of error. Emily took a small step forward, not aggressive, not confrontational, just enough to stand beside the equation rather than behind it. And when she spoke, her voice remained even. "Of course," she said, "scrutiny is important." And for a brief moment, it sounded like agreement, like deference. But then she continued, "That is why each step is consistent with the conditions." She gestured lightly to the transformation she had corrected, "and why the result does not diverge." Her tone did not rise, did not challenge. But the logic in her words did not leave room for dismissal. The room held that again, that quiet recognition, and somewhere in the back, a student who had been recording lowered his phone completely, his attention no longer on capturing a moment of embarrassment, but on understanding what he was seeing. Harrington's fingers brushed against the edge of the desk as he considered his next words, the usual patterns no longer fitting as easily as they once had, because every attempt to reframe the situation seemed to circle back to the same point. The solution worked, and more than that, it improved upon what had been presented. "Where did you study this approach?" he asked finally, the question slipping out before he could fully shape it into something else. And the shift in tone did not go unnoticed. It was no longer a challenge, not quite, but something closer to inquiry. Emily paused for a fraction of a second, her eyes steady. "I did not study it formally," she said, and a few students exchanged glances, confusion flickering across their faces, because the answer did not align with what they were witnessing. "I worked through similar problems on my own," she added, and the simplicity of the statement only deepened the contrast, not boasting, not defensive, just factual. Harrington nodded slowly, though the movement lacked its usual certainty. "Self-study." He repeated, as if testing the phrase, as if trying to fit it into a framework that made sense to him. But the more he considered it, the more it resisted easy categorization, because what stood on the board was not the result of casual effort. It was the product of something far more disciplined, far more precise. The class remained silent, not out of discomfort now, but out of focus, a collective attention, drawn toward a moment that had shifted from spectacle to revelation. And in that silence, the earlier laughter felt distant, almost misplaced. Emily stepped back slightly, creating space again between herself and the board, her role in the moment complete, not seeking validation, not waiting for approval, just present. Harrington looked at her, really looked this time, not as an interruption, not as an anomaly, but as someone who had just altered the dynamic of his classroom in a way he had not anticipated. And as he opened his mouth to speak again, the words carried a different weight, shaped not by assumption, but by the undeniable fact that the person he had chosen to diminish had just redefined the standard in front of everyone. Professor Harrington let the silence stretch a moment longer, as if weighing something unseen. Then he reached for the chalk again, slower this time, less certain, and turned back to the board. "There is," he began, his voice measured, "another way to approach this problem." And for a brief second, it sounded like the familiar rhythm of authority returning, like the lecture resuming its natural course. But the room did not shift with him. It stayed anchored to what Emily had already revealed. He wrote a new line beneath her solution, attempting to reconstruct the pathway he had originally intended, his movements precise but lacking the earlier fluid confidence. And as he progressed, it became clear that he was not correcting her. He was working around her, trying to establish an alternative that would restore his position without directly confronting what stood above. Emily watched quietly, her expression unchanged, her presence no longer invisible, and that alone altered the dynamic, because now every mark he made was being observed not just by students, but by someone who had already demonstrated she could see beyond the surface. A student near the aisle leaned forward, eyes moving between the two solutions, whispering, "It is longer," and another replied under his breath, "And it still depends on the same assumption." Their voices low but carrying enough to ripple outward. Harrington paused, chalk hovering midair, and for a moment, he seemed to consider erasing what he had just written, but instead, he pressed forward, completing the line with a firm stroke, then stepping back as if to present it. "This method," he said, turning slightly toward the class, "follows a more conventional structure." The word conventional landing with less certainty than before. The students did not respond the way they usually did. There was no immediate nodding, no automatic acceptance, only quiet comparison, eyes scanning the board, weighing one against the other. And in that comparison, the difference became harder to ignore. Emily shifted her gaze to his work, studying it briefly, then looking back to her own, not with pride, not with challenge, but with the calm focus of someone evaluating information rather than defending it. And after a short pause, she spoke, her voice even. "It still relies on the same boundary inconsistency," she said, not interrupting him, not raising her tone, simply stating what she saw. Harrington's jaw tightened slightly. "Explain," he said, though the word came out more as a request than a command this time. Emily stepped closer to the board again, lifting the chalk without hesitation, and gently underlined a section of his newly written line. "Right here," she said. "The transformation assumes continuity that does not hold under the constraint." Her explanation was concise, direct, and as she spoke, the logic unfolded in a way that made the flaw visible, not just to experts, but to the students who had been following along. A low murmur spread through the room, not laughter, not mockery, but recognition, the kind that builds when understanding clicks into place. Harrington stared at the point she had indicated, his mind moving quickly, retracing the logic, and the more he examined it, the more the realization settled in. The correction was valid, not a matter of opinion, not a stylistic difference, but a structural truth. He lowered the chalk slowly, his hand no longer as steady as before, and for a brief moment, he said nothing. The absence of immediate response louder than any defense could have been. Emily stepped back again, returning the space to him, her role not to dominate, not to claim victory, but simply to clarify, and that restraint carried its own weight. The room watched, waiting, the earlier expectation of embarrassment long gone, replaced by a quiet anticipation of how this would resolve, because the outcome no longer belonged to assumption, it belonged to what had been demonstrated. Harrington exhaled slowly, a subtle release of tension that did not go unnoticed, and when he finally spoke, his voice was different, not diminished, but altered, shaped by the moment he could not reverse. "Your observation," he said carefully, "is accurate." The pause before the final word small, but significant, and as it settled into the room, a shift completed itself, not dramatic, not loud, but undeniable, because in that acknowledgement, the hierarchy that had defined the space just minutes ago had been quietly, irrevocably changed, and for the first time, no one questioned who had truly understood the problem. Standing on that board, the words settled into the room like a quiet verdict, not loud, not dramatic, but final in a way that no raised voice could ever achieve. And for a brief moment, no one moved, no one spoke, because what had just happened did not fit the script they had all expected to follow. Professor Harrington stood still beside the board, his gaze lingering on the solution as if searching for one last angle, one last possibility that might restore the familiar structure of authority, but the clarity of what was written left no such opening, and that realization carried a weight he could not ignore. Emily remained where she was, calm, composed, her hands resting lightly at her sides, not claiming the moment, not drawing attention to herself, and that restraint only deepened the contrast, because the absence of arrogance made the outcome impossible to dismiss. as anything other than genuine. A student in the front row shifted in his seat, glancing around as if expecting someone else to speak, to react, but the room held its silence, the kind that comes not from uncertainty, but from collective understanding. Harrington cleared his throat softly, the sound breaking the stillness just enough to draw attention back to him. And when he spoke, his voice carried a different tone, not weakened, but tempered, shaped by the recognition of something he had not anticipated. Mathematics, he said slowly, is built on precision. The words familiar, almost rehearsed, but the way he delivered them now felt less like a lecture and more like an acknowledgement. And precision requires openness to correction, he added, and the sentence lingered in the air, carrying more meaning than its simplicity suggested. A few students exchanged glances, subtle nods passing between them, because they understood what had just been said, not just the words, but the shift behind them. Emily looked at the board once more, then back at Harrington, her expression unchanged, not seeking approval, not expecting recognition, only present in the moment as it unfolded. Harrington gestured lightly toward the equation. Your approach, he continued, pausing briefly as if choosing his words carefully, demonstrates a level of insight that goes beyond standard instruction. And this time, there was no attempt to reframe it, no effort to diminish it, only a statement of fact. The room absorbed that, the acknowledgement carrying more weight than any applause could have, because it came from the very source that had tried to challenge her. A student near the back finally spoke, his voice tentative but clear. So, her method is better? And the question hung in the air, direct, unfiltered, forcing a clarity that no longer allowed for ambiguity. Harrington did not answer immediately, his eyes returning to the board, tracing the logic once more, and when he finally responded, his voice was steady, grounded in the reality he could no longer avoid. In this case, he said, it is more efficient and more accurate. The words simple, but their impact unmistakable. A quiet shift moved through the room, not loud, not disruptive, but complete, the kind that redefines how everyone present understands what they have just witnessed. Emily exhaled softly, almost imperceptibly, as if releasing a tension that had never fully surfaced, and she stepped back another inch, creating space once again, not lingering at the center of attention, not holding on to the moment longer than necessary. Harrington watched her for a second longer, his expression no longer marked by dismissal, but by something closer to respect. Though it remained unspoken, the class remained silent, but it was no longer the silence of anticipation or doubt. It was the silence of recognition, of something learned that extended beyond the equation itself. And in that stillness, as the chalkboard stood filled with a solution that had quietly overturned every assumption made just minutes before, the room understood something far more lasting than the problem they had come to solve. That understanding does not announce itself. It reveals itself, often from the place least expected, and when it does, it leaves no room for anything but acknowledgement. No one returned to their notes. No one reached for their keyboards, because the equation on the board was no longer just a problem solved. It had become something else entirely, a moment that quietly redefined who held authority in that room. And Professor Harrington seemed to understand that as he stepped away from the board, not abruptly, not defeated, but with a deliberate calm that suggested he was choosing his next move carefully rather than reacting to the last one. His gaze shifted back to Emily, studying her not as an interruption, not as a curiosity, but as someone whose presence now demanded acknowledgement. And when he spoke again, his voice carried a measured respect that had not been there before. Miss, he began, pausing just enough to invite her name rather than assume it. Carter, Emily replied softly, her tone steady, neither hesitant nor assertive, simply factual. Harrington nodded once. Miss Carter, he repeated, and even that small act, the use of her name, altered the atmosphere further, grounding her presence in a way that could no longer be dismissed. He glanced briefly at the board, then back at her. Have you considered formal study in mathematics? The question landed differently than anything he had said before, not as a challenge, not as a test, but as a genuine inquiry. And the room felt it immediately. A few students exchanged quick looks, surprised. Not by the question itself, but by the shift it represented, because moments ago, she had been an object of quiet amusement, and now she was being addressed as someone worthy of academic pursuit. Emily paused, just for a second, as if weighing how much to reveal, then answered simply, "I have," she said. "A long time ago." Her words calm, but carrying something deeper beneath the surface. Something unspoken that did not need explanation to be understood. Harrington's expression tightened. Slightly, not in dismissal, but in thought, as if he were reconsidering assumptions he had made without realizing it. "And you chose a different path," he said, not as a judgment, but as a recognition. Emily gave a small nod. "Life does that sometimes," she replied, and there was no bitterness in her voice, no regret, only acceptance, and that quiet honesty seemed to settle into the room just as deeply as her solution had. A student near the window leaned back in his chair, arms crossed loosely. Now, no longer skeptical, but attentive in a different way, as if trying to understand not just what she had done, but who she was. Harrington exhaled slowly, his posture shifting ever so slightly, less rigid, more open, and for the first time, he did not look like a man defending a position, but like someone adjusting to a new reality. "Well," he said, glancing again at the board, "mathematics tends to find its way back to those who understand it." The statement carried a quiet weight, not a lecture, not a correction, but something closer to an acknowledgement of truth. Emily did not respond immediately, her gaze resting briefly on the equation before she spoke again. "It never really left," she said. And the simplicity of that sentence carried more depth than any explanation could have. The room absorbed it in silence, a few students lowering their eyes to their notes, not out of disengagement, but out of reflection, as if recalibrating their understanding of what they had just witnessed. Harrington looked at her for a moment longer, then gave a slight nod, the kind that did not demand attention but still carried significance. "Thank you," he said, and the words were quiet, almost understated, but unmistakably sincere. Emily inclined her head slightly in return, not seeking more, not holding the moment. And then, without drawing attention to herself, she stepped back toward the side of the room, returning to the place she had started, but not to the role she had once occupied. The class remained still, no one rushing to speak, no one eager to break what had settled over them, because something had changed, not just in the hierarchy of the room, but in the way they saw the space itself, the assumptions they carried into it. And as Professor Harrington turned back toward the board, preparing to continue the lecture, the equation behind him stood unchanged, but everything around it felt different, as if the room itself had learned something it would not easily forget. The lecture did not resume the way it usually did. Even though Professor Harrington turned back to the board and picked up the chalk again, there was a subtle hesitation in the room, a lingering awareness that something had shifted beyond the equation itself. And as he began writing a new problem, his movements were more deliberate, less performative, as if he understood now that every line would be examined more closely than before. The students followed along, but not with the same passive certainty, their attention sharper, more questioning, as though the moment they had just witnessed had quietly rewritten the rules of the room. Emily stood near the side wall again, her cart beside her posture unchanged, but her presence now carried a quiet gravity, no longer invisible, no longer dismissed, and a few students found their eyes drifting toward her, not out of curiosity alone, but out of recognition. A young woman in the third row hesitated, then slowly raised her hand, something she had not done once during the entire semester. And when Harrington nodded for her to speak, she asked, "Could the same adjustment apply here?" Her voice cautious, but steady, and the question itself was different from the usual ones, not seeking confirmation, but exploring possibility. Harrington paused, looking at the new equation, then briefly at Emily, just for a fraction of a second, before answering. "It might," he said, his tone thoughtful rather than dismissive, "depending on how the constraints are defined." And the response carried an openness that had not been present before. The student nodded, jotting down notes quickly, and the energy in the room shifted again, not dramatic, but real, as if the space had become less about authority and more about understanding. Another student leaned forward, speaking without raising his hand this time. "So we should always check the assumptions first, and instead of correcting him for speaking out of turn, Harrington simply replied, "Yes," his voice calm. "Always." And that single word seemed to anchor the lesson more deeply than any structured lecture could have. Emily watched quietly, her eyes moving between the board and the students, not inserting herself into the moment, not seeking to guide it, but simply observing as the room adjusted around her presence. A faint smile touched her expression for just a second, not of pride, but of recognition, as if she had seen this kind of shift before, in a different time, a different place. Harrington continued, working through the new problem step by step, but this time, he paused more often, allowing space for questions, for thought, for the kind of engagement that had not been part of his usual approach, and each pause felt intentional, not uncertain, but reflective. The students responded in kind, their questions more focused, their attention more active, as though they had been given permission to think rather than simply follow. Near the back, the student who had recorded earlier slipped his phone into his bag, no longer interested in capturing a moment of embarrassment, but aware that he had just witnessed something far more valuable. Time passed almost unnoticed, the lecture continuing in a quieter, more deliberate rhythm, and when the clock on the wall finally ticked toward the end of the hour, no one rushed to pack their things as they usually did, the room holding its attention just a moment longer. Harrington set the chalk down once more, turning slightly toward the class, his gaze moving across the students before settling briefly, almost imperceptibly, in Emily's direction. "Next time," he said, "we will build on this approach." And the words carried a subtle acknowledgement, not just of the material, but of where it had come from. A few students nodded, others remained still, absorbing what that meant, and as chairs began to shift and notebooks closed, the usual end-of-class noise returned, but softer, less abrupt. Emily reached for her cardigan, her movements quiet, familiar, as if returning to a routine that had not changed, even though everything around it had. A student paused near her on the way out, hesitating for a second before speaking. "That was really impressive," he said, his tone sincere, without a trace of the earlier condescension, and Emily simply nodded, offering a small, polite smile. "Thank you," she replied, her voice gentle, not lingering on the moment. More students glanced her way as they left, some with curiosity, others with quiet respect, and none of them saw her the same way they had when she first stood at the back of the room. Harrington remained near the board, his eyes lingering on the equation one last time before turning away, his expression thoughtful, as if the lesson had not ended with the bell, but had only just begun, and as the room gradually emptied, the chalkboard remained filled with the solution that had quietly changed everything. A reminder that understanding does not always come from where it is expected, but when it does, it leaves a mark that reshapes the space long after the moment has passed. By the time the last student stepped out of the lecture hall, the energy of the room had not fully settled. It lingered in the quiet scrape of chairs, in the slower footsteps, in the glances cast back toward the board as if confirming that what they had seen was real and not just a moment that would fade with the next class. And Emily Carter moved with the same calm rhythm she had always carried, guiding her cart along the aisle, collecting what had been left behind, papers, empty cups, the small traces of a class that had begun like any other and ended as something else entirely. Professor Harrington remained at the front, not gathering his things immediately, not rushing out as he sometimes did, but standing near the chalkboard, his eyes tracing the lines of the solution one more time, not with resistance now, but with a quiet respect, as though he understood that what had been written there had not only solved a problem, but revealed something he had overlooked. Emily approached the front slowly, not to draw attention, not to revisit the moment, but simply to continue her work, and as she reached for the eraser, her hand paused for just a second, her gaze resting on the equation that had shifted the entire room, and there was no pride in her expression, no need to preserve it, only a quiet understanding that it had already done what it needed to do. Harrington noticed the pause and spoke, his voice low, no longer carrying the weight of performance. "You can leave it," he said, and the suggestion hung between them, not as a command, but as a consideration. Emily looked at him briefly, then back at the board. "It is part of the lesson now," she replied gently, And there was something in the way she said it that made the decision clear, not dismissing his suggestion, but placing the value of the moment in what came next rather than what had already passed. Harrington nodded once, slowly, accepting the reasoning without argument, and stepped aside as she continued, the eraser moving across the board in smooth, deliberate strokes, the chalk lines fading one by one, not erased in haste, but with a kind of quiet finality. The room grew emptier, the echo of footsteps fading down the hallway, until only the two of them remained, the silence no longer heavy, but settled, almost reflective. Harrington glanced at her again, as if considering something he had not yet said, and then, after a brief pause, he spoke. There is an evening seminar, he said, his tone measured. Advanced topics, small group. He hesitated for just a fraction of a second before continuing. You would be welcome to attend, and the invitation was simple, but it carried more than its words suggested, not just an opportunity, but an acknowledgement of where she belonged. Emily finished clearing the last section of the board, placing the eraser back in its tray before responding, her voice calm. Thank you, she said, and for a moment, it seemed like that might be all, but then she added, I will think about it. And the answer was neither acceptance nor refusal, but something more deliberate, a choice rather than a reaction. Harrington inclined his head slightly, understanding that, respecting it, and did not press further. The chalkboard now stood clean again, empty, waiting for the next class, the next equation, the next assumption that might or might not be challenged. And as Emily turned to leave, guiding her cart toward the door, her presence felt different, not louder, not more visible in any obvious way, but grounded in something that could not be overlooked again. Harrington remained where he was for a moment longer, looking at the blank board, and then, almost to himself, he murmured, Precision requires humility. The words quiet, but certain, as if the lesson had settled into him as well. The hallway outside carried the distant hum of campus life, students moving between classes, conversations rising and falling, unaware of what had just unfolded inside that room, and Emily stepped into it without hesitation, without looking back, her path unchanged on the surface,